Welcome to another episode of the Becoming Noble podcast. Today, I'm joined by Mary Harrington, who many of you will know, and I'm extremely grateful, has agreed to join me for a conversation about her piece on scrolling towards God, which is quite a provocative suggestion that such a thing is possible, but I think actually is a gateway to some very interesting themes indeed. Mary, in true reactionary style, is calling in from the woods, which is quite wonderful. It's the first time I've ever had this kind of conversation. So if you hear some slight wind noises or anything like that, don't be alarmed. That is the sound of nature reimposing itself on our reality, as should be the case. Mary, thank you for coming on. Welcome to the show. And maybe do you want to give a very quick introduction to yourself and why you're thinking about these issues of technology and God?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I don't think I've ever tried this before either. I'm literally, it's 7:30 in the morning and I'm walking the dog through the woods, and trying to do that and have a conversation about the internet is just a really interesting thought experiment in its own right. Throws up probably relevant questions to the essay that you want to discuss. I'm not going to try and introduce myself, except to say, I'm a writer who became one accidentally, and I publish on Substack and a bunch of other places. And the essay that I wrote is actually the product of, it must be like a 20-year line of thought and inquiry about the relationship between reading and consciousness. I studied English literature and was fortunate to get a chronological and quite thorough grounding in English literature at a time where people actually still did think historically or were willing to teach historically. And one of the upshots of that for me was a very clear picture by the time I finished of the history of English literature, particularly as one of an evolution of consciousness, in a much broader sense than just books. It's a document through which, if you read filtering for that, you can discern an evolution of consciousness over time on a number of different axes. And I left university with a very vivid picture of that as a sort of centuries long arc, and I've been filling in pieces in that overall arc for at least 2 decades since then. So the scrolling towards the divine is I guess that's just sort of picks out one node on that very lengthy line of inquiry, which is about the relationship between that overall evolutionary arc, if you like, and the introduction of digital as a medium and what that does to how people think, how people read, which are two very nested things. And a third aspect of really the same picture, which is how we think about the spiritual world, because it's clear the moment you start thinking about, the moment you start rummaging around in information or reading and metaphysics, it just becomes very clear that there isn't really a dividing line between how we think about reading and how we read and how we think about the world of ideas, which is to say, more precisely, the spiritual world, the world beyond the material. I have a lot more to say about this, but just particularly in the context of the essay which you wanted to talk about. The argument that I wanted to make, or the very small piece of a much larger argument that I wanted to make, was that digital reading, as distinct from print reading, that retrieves a mode of cognition which has been out of use, has been disused, and sort of left in a cupboard for a good few centuries now, which is pattern recognition, which is to say noticing rather than analysis. I think that's probably the most succinct summary. You think about the usage across esoteric corners of the internet, the meaning of the word noticing and the context in which that gets used, and the esoteric significance that's ascribed to it. What we're talking about is a very different mode of perception to analysis, which seeks to cut things down into their component parts and then analyze them, as it were, in a sort of linear and a causal way. And my argument in scrolling towards the divine is that digital reading, because there's just so much content out there, there's too much content out there, it's not possible to even think about trying to comprehend the entirety of it, retrieves pattern recognition as a mode of making sense of it. You sort of swim in a vast ocean of content, and let it pass through you, and you discern trends and patterns. And it's not a directly intellectual and analytical way of relating to the material. And the argument that I wanted to make is that although that's not the same as perceiving the world of ideas directly, if you approach it in a thoughtful way and recognize that the map is not the territory, it conditions a much greater capacity to see the world of ideas, or the world of forms, if you like, directly, rather than simply trying to rationalize them into existence, or conversely rationalize them out of existence. I mean, I don't think I said all of this exactly in the essay. It's Substack. You sort of have to, you have to write in a more conversational way, and you can't just kind of ramble on endlessly because you'll try people's patience. But I mean, this is the terrain that I'm thinking in, and this is really my main field of interest at the moment, and my main line of inquiry is thinking about information, changes in consciousness, and particularly a huge transformative impact, which I think anyone with eyes and a functioning brain can see the internet has already had, and what that means at the macro cultural and political levels. And I think we're already starting to see some of those downstream consequences, but I think it has metaphysical implications as well, which need further study, and that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm interested in.
No, the unstructured ramble is what we're here to do today in podcast form. So no apologies necessary. So maybe to give my sort of spin on the structure you pursue in the essay, and you can tell me if this about accords with what you were attempting for. It would be something like the last few hundred years of intellectual history, and indeed the downstream sort of popular media history, has been defined by various centralized core monolithic narratives and theories about existence, which express themselves first in academic centers, but then even if you think about popular media, which people consume like television over the course of the last century, that's still based on a script which has been intentionally written and mass distributed by writers. Now, that paradigm is being increasingly challenged by people engaging in a sort of distributed pattern recognition, often from first principles, due to the vast and fragmented content people now consume. And the way you put it, I'm sure you're aware of this, maybe you're not, but you interpreted the content people consume in an incredibly intellectual way, with the assumption that they're just sort of reading. But if you think about TikTok, it's sort of the phenomenon you're describing on steroids, which is that it's tiny flashes of unstructured, organic content that are flashing past every few seconds. And most people, even if they're reading, aren't reading long form. I think
that's a whole secondary level of the discussion, is what happens as that stratifies, which I think is an interesting question in its own right. Once you have probably a majority of people who are doing pattern recognition in the mode I described, but they're not really doing it through the medium of reading at all. They're post-literate. I mean, this is a phenomenon that's been commented on plenty already. There's the phenomenon of post-literacy, a sort of secondary orality, I think is the term somebody coined. It might have been I'm not sure. And that's an interesting question. To what extent does that actually stratify cognition? How does that stratify, the way people are able to socialize or think about things? And what in turn does that do to our metaphysics? Is it even possible to have a shared frame of reality at all under those circumstances? These are, I don't know the answer to any of those things, but I find those questions very interesting.
So your thesis is that in order to correctly pursue pattern recognition, this means recognizing universal forms, and universal forms are, of course, not just physical, but are real, interwoven, universal.
I think I should probably, I realise I ought to explain some of the pegs that I hung this on. I mean, this is a long-standing thesis of mine, but I described the line of thought without referencing any of the arguments which I pointed to in the essay. the 2 points really that I hung this on were the reappearance in meme culture of the pre-modern world of science, which I think is beautiful and also unnerving. So in pre-modern England, before mass literacy, so let's say approximately up to the time of Shakespeare, maybe a little bit beyond, depending on who and where you are, majority of people couldn't read, and it's sometimes I try and imagine what that would be like, and it's kind of difficult to grok, really, because I'm so suffused by reading as a person. I personally find that very difficult to imagine. But majority of people couldn't read, and encountered the world through, culture was still very, very much alive and well, and there were common shared frames of reference, but they were visual. They were visual and they were mimetic, in a sense that people who can speak meme will recognize instinctively, but people in the modern world that interposed itself between the medieval one and the mimetic one we're in now, just struggle to grasp at all. They reduce the idea of a meme or a symbol or to a sign in the medieval sense, or a meme in the 21st, in the postmodern one, to a symbol, as in something which stands directly for something else. But signs and memes don't really work like that. They're not reducible to symbols. It's not A equals B. So for example, the sun equals, any symbol you care to name, there's always a bit left over. The one thing is not exactly the same as another, and it's in this slight difference between it that the energy of the symbolic comparison resides. But the moderns kind of did the best to ignore that. And the point is that the medievals, your average Joe, would walk around a city and would navigate by pictures, and would find a shop at the sign of the White Rose, or at the sign of the compasses, or some other picture. And those signs themselves had very complex meanings that would evolve over time, and existed as a kind of common mimetic sphere. And people understood instinctively that was a place in its own right. The memeplex was a place in its own right. And they used the term commonplace, not in its dismissive modern sense, but as a common place. The world of signs was a place where minds could meet, as if in a market square, as if in a town square, as a common place. And this is just completely lost over the modern era, because people stopped being able to see the world in that way. And what I find so interesting about meme culture, and so invigorating, actually, that's why I love spending time there, is that it brings that back. You can take, there are various different memes of sort of greater or more or less cursed nature. But just take the Wojak as a case in point. I'm not sure how people pronounce that. The guy, the sketchy line drawing, and there's a whole visual language. There's a whole mimetic language of them. Or Pepe is pretty much a living character in the memeplex now. Pepe is a commonplace. Where ideas are exchanged, where whole nested sets of meanings are discussed in a register which is not analytic. It's a register of noticing. It's not the register of analysis. Exactly, it's creative rather than. It doesn't cut things into pieces. It puts things back together again. That's probably the best way I can describe it. And I link this to Walter J. Ong, who writes about orality and literacy, and the effect that mass literacy had in changing the way people perceived the world. The way they perceived themselves, the way they understood what a self is as such, even the way people understood time and memory were completely transformed by access to literacy. Now, which started really back in the Axial Age. And it's not a coincidence that Plato starts talking about the soul at about the point where people start reading. The two things are very closely connected. That's a whole sidebar. There's a very deep rabbit hole, that one. But just bringing this back to scrolling towards the divine, I think, if you think of the meme world as a mode of retrieving the medieval world of science, in the context of a kind of engagement with information. And you're right to point out that it isn't just reading. by no means. And for the majority of people, I'd say now it's not, if not exactly post-literate, it's a much more textured business than simply reading long-form sequential arguments in books. But that mode of engaging with information retrieves the medieval world of science in a way which in turn retrieves a whole load of other medieval cognitive and metaphysical possibilities, along lines that I find quite exciting, but which seem to me in visceral and immediate relation to the world of living ideas.
May I offer you a slightly different spin on your own idea to see how you react to it? And there's an Ongian tie-in here. Intuitively, part of your central thesis feels like there's something real there to me, which is that in getting people attuned to translating the various symbolic information that they imbibe in the world back into this sort of higher order world of forms, that forms this sort of bridge to the divine, which is, of course, the ultimate transcendent category. One thing I thought was interesting was that the vehicle you used for this was the world of forms, which is obviously a Platonic idea. And as you say, Ong points out that the world of forms is itself such an abstract idea, philosophically speaking, that it could only be the product of a literate culture, that Plato actually represents a radical departure from earlier Greek philosophers who were embedded in an oral culture. So rather than deploying the world of forms, I might suggest that what's happening here with mimetic signifiers and so forth is people becoming reacquainted to thinking metaphorically. And when you become entrapped in a world without metaphor due to the dominance of analytic, linguistic formulas, and then you move back into a purely visual and relationship medium, like, say TikTok or something, this gets you used to establishing direct felt relationships between things and events in a sort of more subtle way than categorical forms. And in a way, this brings us closer to the world of an oral culture in which the limited vocabulary of the culture, it's thousands of words rather than millions of words, forces constant use of metaphor to convey complex information which can't be condensed purely into the limited words they have at their disposal. This in turn ties us very directly into the external world, which, because of this metaphysical, metaphorical relationship we now have to it, we see as directly imbued with meaning, and each thing is interwoven with each other and ourselves. And this is a living world. So a move away from formal language, where the point of writing is to distinguish, to differentiate, to dissect, to freeze, to isolate ideas, and into this very dynamic, metaphorically laden world in which it's much easier to perceive the things which lie between the gaps, which lie in uniting higher orders of ideas and things and beings and so forth.
So do I just? I don't disagree with anything that you just said. Absolutely. I'm cautious of using the word form, especially if I seem to be using it in a sense that implies a capital F, because I'm just hesitant to stand on a philosophical landmine that I don't really feel like I've read enough to defend all the way down to its roots. I'm sort of. My use of that word is exploratory at the moment, because I just haven't found a better one yet. I haven't found one which points in as many directions as that one. But I mean, if you wanted to be more sort of epistemologically cautious about what's happening, your framing is perfectly adequate. If you want, I think if you want to start from a more ambitious standpoint, and argue the conclusion in some wilder directions, then forms is a useful term, with all of its metaphysical connotations. But sure, I don't disagree with anything you just said. I think that's a very palatable way of describing it, which doesn't compel the reader / listener to commit to any sort of great leaps of faith that they may or may not be ready to take. So yeah, fine, sure.
It's an interesting question because on the one hand, one senses, and maybe I can get away with this as a religious person myself, a certain insulting subtext to the idea that as we move away from sort of from a fully literate, analytical, abstract culture into a more fragmented, intuitive, metaphorical, visual culture, post-literate, that religion again becomes easier, which is I think an idea that I agree with, but requires careful handling so that it doesn't come across as insulting. But I don't think it need to. I mean, if you think about, Luke 4:16, faith comes through hearing. There is this notion that perhaps by interposing the dead word on the page, the transmission of faith purely through writing is actually far more interrupted than it would be in a much more direct relationship driven world, like, certainly TikTok, where you're looking at someone's face, you're hearing their off the cuff thoughts, but even Substack, where you have a much more informal, personal and sustained relationship with a single author, as opposed to the kind of newspaper format where you're reading a semi-anonymous sort of regime approved apparatchik again and again amongst thousands of others of similar editorialized pieces. So yeah, it's a kind of interesting, the thing that sort of remains for me to identify, and I think this would be the final piece of the argument, is like, what's the exact mechanism by which someone actually becomes religious, right? And starts practicing and starts believing in God. Because like theoretically, this framework is compelling to me. And I think the evidence is probably there on the other side that some people have certainly found religion through even things like Twitter. But what's the mechanism by which one is truly swept up into this world of ideas and feelings to such an extent that one's fundamental...
There isn't a mechanism because it's not a mechanistic process. At the end of the day, free will is irreducible, and I mean that's that. I can't. I'm not going to try and prove that. I just think it's true. Free will is irreducible, and the willingness or ability to believe arises from our free will. Nobody can be forced to believe something. So there is no mechanism, pretty much by definition, for arriving at faith. That's just something that everybody that must be people must come to that. And you can a different habituating people to a different way of thinking can perhaps lead one all the way to the edge, but at the end there's a I don't know if you've read the Divine Comedy, but the point where Dante gets to the top of purgatory, and then he there's this is actually you should, I don't know if you've ever do you know Botticelli's pictures of the Divine Comedy? Absolutely extraordinary sketches, line drawings that Botticelli did of the Divine Comedy. One of the most affecting of those that's just stuck in my mind ever since I saw it again about 20 years ago, is the one where Dante is depicted standing right at the pinnacle of purgatory, and right at the point of being able to make contact with Beatrice, who's in the realm above. And she's reaching out to him and he's reaching out to her. And I don't remember if their fingers are touching or not, but there's this incredible sense of yearning. And the picture itself poses the question of whether or not Dante is going to take that step or not, because and just makes it very clear that that step is his to take or not to take. And I suppose that would be my answer to the question of what is the mechanism? There isn't one. The step is yours to take or not to take.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's sort of like faith is well, it's complex because on the one hand, it is the agency of the individual is unquestionable. It's a choice they have to make, exactly as you say. On the other hand, also, as you say, it's not a mechanistic process. And I think there's a danger coming out of the highly analytical, systematic philosophical tradition that the West has created over the last few hundred years, that people sort of try to argue themselves into believing in God. And that's not really a Christian position. Or I mean, there are certainly what we view as valid logical proofs for the existence of God, but faith is supposed to be a virtue that is received from God. So it's more a question of disposition and asking and receiving, rather than sort of taking it upon one's shoulders to formulate entirely coherent human proofs that then serve as the sort of like totally satisfactory foundation for the divine.
Just so, I mean, I suppose this is the gripe I have with the whole cultural Christianity thing. You know, it can take you all the way up to the edge, and you can see Beatrice reaching out her hand, and then you're like, no, I need to see a scientific paper that proves this, otherwise I'm not going to reach back. I mean, there's a whole genre now of they tend to be quote unquote anti-woke. They tend to be people who figured out that actually Christianity plays certain significant cultural roles, but they're having gone all the way to the highest of high European literature. I'm now going to plumb the depths of pulp fiction. There's a fantasy fiction series. I forget the name of the author, but it's called Thomas Covenant, Unbeliever. And the central bit of the whole series is that this guy Thomas Covenant is transported from sort of boring 80s kind of humdrum everyday America into a high fantasy magical world with monsters and elves and creatures and magic and so on. But he doesn't believe it's happening. No, at no point in the entire series does he believe it's happening. He's just like, no, this is all just a weird, complicated dream that I'm having. None of this is real. And it just keeps somehow saving the day anyway. And the whole story is about him somehow being compelled again and again and again to reconcile his radical skepticism about what's actually happening to him with the fact that he actually cares about what's happening to him, even though he doesn't really believe that it's real. And every time I see the rationalizers of Christianity, and there are many of them now, some of them fairly well known, wrestling with the possibility of God and trying to reason themselves into it, I think of Thomas Covenant, and I think, man, you could just make life, just do the thing. It's so much easier. But yeah, it's many such cases, I suppose, is all I can say. Sort of Thomas Covenant Christianity is a difficulty that a lot of people are grappling with at the moment. And at the end of the day, you take the step or you don't take the step, and perhaps, as you say, it's about asking or being invited. It's certainly not about analytical logic, or even really about the capacity to think metaphorically, although that probably helps. But again, that doesn't take you all the way there. And I think that's something else which I haven't had a chance to expand on yet, but that I think is also important in the context of thinking about how pattern recognition retrieves the capacity to access some of these ways of thinking, is that really the map is not the territory. And I think there's a whole other set of pitfalls, sometimes quite concerning ones sometimes, that arise when you conflate the world of the internet with the world of ideas, because they're not quite the one is a very good simulacrum of the other, but they're not the same thing at all. And there are, I don't know, there be dragons is all I really want to say improvisingly about that at the moment. You don't know what you're going to find there and what its intentions are.
One of the things that I think this is related to, that again I haven't really thought through properly myself, but I'd be curious for your reaction to, is there's this question of why, once you enter into meme culture, right-wing or reactionary traditionalist ideas seem to outperform left-wing ideas, and that's sort of materializing in quite a radical subset of the youth.
That has quite a straightforward answer, I think. The left as such, and particularly in it, the left is sort of nominal. The left is really radical nominalism, which is about waging war on the idea of normativity. Or at least that's the point it's arrived at now. Waging war on the idea that forms pre-exist their instantiation in reality. And if you're a nominalist, then you can't do pattern recognition, because the whole point of view is that pattern recognition is not a thing. So of course the other side does better.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I was going to say, like, this is why you end up with the situation where right-wing memes, and for me, the sort of canonical example is like Giga Chad,
Right.
to the point where there's a very funny image I saw once, which is it's two people having an argument, and one says to the other, "Thank you for making your case, but I'm afraid I was the first one to post an image in which I am the Giga Chad and you are the Soy Jack." And it's a sort of just like purely mimetic, symbolic battle rather than anything taking
Yep.
place in language whatsoever. But I think once you move into the world of signifiers, and this is, I guess, easy to say as someone with sympathies that lie on the right, it's far easier for a traditionalist-oriented section of the debate to condense very complex, old, rich, real-world ideas into single symbols than it is for people with new or transgressive ideas. And that's why you end up with a phenomenon where sort of left-wing meme is wall of text next to small image, because they have to explain the entire worldview that it's impossible to condense into a symbol, because it isn't a symbol of anything. It's a sort of artificial creation, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely, precisely. I suppose another way of saying it is that Judith Butler had to write walls and walls and walls of completely impenetrable text in order to get people to believe in the idea that sexual sex dimorphism isn't a thing, and that there aren't men and women. And yet, my child could tell the difference pretty reliably between a man and a woman by the time she was 2. I mean, that's at a very basic cognitive level. People see pattern. We may get socialized out of it in the everyday world of the culture as it currently is, but people still see it. They've just been educated to pretend that they can't. And the world of memes, it dresses to the right, shall we say, because it just sweeps all of that off the table. And it's like, yeah, we're all socialized to pretend that this stuff isn't there, but clearly it's there. I mean, just look, open your eyes, it's right there.
Cool. Well, I won't hold you for too long. I'm just trying to think if there are any other aspects. I guess the final observation I'd make, well, one thing that came to mind when you were speaking earlier is you said even 2-year-olds can tell the difference between men and women. Unfortunately, I learned the hard way that this is not always the case. The other day when my young son shouted at a woman on the street for literally unprompted, just pointed at her and shouted, "That's a man." So it's not always as smooth as one would hope. Yeah. But
yeah, I mean, it's you get better at it, but I'd say a good sort of 85% hit rate by the time you're about 2. And yeah. It's closer to 99.9% by the time you're really not much older than that.
No, well, let's wrap up there. It'll be interesting to see how this battle sort of unfolds over the next decade, because the tech companies have been brought to the point where they themselves are having to actively engage in this conflict. In that, if you think about what AI algorithms do in large language models and in the generation of people's feeds, the sorting of people's feeds, these are unstructured learning algorithms, so they're independently noting associations and data sets. And tech companies have discovered that's actually very problematic from their point of view, and the kinds of associations that are quickly made have to large corpuses of those have to be erased and rewritten, and they go through what's called reinforcement learning, which is the sort of like, okay, you've noticed everything, now we're going to tell you everything you have to unnotice, and we're going to reinforce into you, Clockwork Orange style, the sort of correct narrative. So ignore all those symbolic and metaphorical associations you just made.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, gosh, yeah, AI is a whole other rabbit hole to go down here. On the question of the difference between pattern recognition and comprehension is a whole other thing. But I mean, really, the difference between those two things rests in the difference between reaching out towards Beatrice and actually taking that step. Whether or not you're willing to comprehend that difference. I mean, there's we're back at the metaphysical threshold again. Right, Safi's just found two of her other dog friends, so I think I should probably wrap up at this point.
Wonderful. Let's say goodbye.
Do you
want to say anywhere where people can find you? Anything you want to point people to?
Sure. I mean, you can find most of my writing at Unheard, UNHERD, and on Substack at maryharrington.co.uk. It's been fun to talk. Thanks, Johann.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Mary. To unlock premium episodes, as well as over 100 essays and other benefits, go to becomingnoble.substack.com/audio for an exclusive 10% discount for podcast listeners. That's becomingnoble.substack.com/audio. Enjoy.